We have been following in the travels of the Apostle Paul. We're in the second of his three, what we often refer to as his missionary journeys, and we continue to study concerning this second trip this morning. Where have we seen him at here in chapter 18 thus far? Okay, we first saw him, if you go back, in Athens, and he was waiting for whom? He was waiting for Timothy and Silas, but finally Paul just couldn't, for lack of a better description, couldn't take it anymore. He'd seen all this superstition and religion all around him and all these altars and idols, and finally he just ends up having to speak up, and he begins to declare to them the unknown God, and the one they didn't know was the one they should know, and He's the great Creator of all things. And then where do we find him? He travels into Corinth, and kind of a mixed kind of feel in Corinth in some ways. You have this initial challenge in relationship to the things that are happening in Corinth, but yet Paul's able to stay there for a period of time. Who is converted there in Corinth? It's an interesting kind of person we talked about last week. Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, was converted to Jesus, and we learn later that it appears that he was replaced as the chief ruler of the synagogue after that. And then we see an interesting scene there with Sosthenes that we discussed in our study last week. We learned then in verse 18 that after this, he tarried there yet a good while, and then took his leave of the brethren, and sailed thence into Syria, and with him Priscilla and Aquila, having shorn his head in Cenchrea, for he had a vow. And so as we continue in his travelings together here, we can appreciate that he's been in several different locations. If you recall, he has been in Athens, which is... let me grab the other remote so I can get a laser. Athens is... switch. Oh, it's barely on. There you go. If you can barely see it, it's never mind, you'll never see that. Trust me, Athens is in Greece. It's over here on the left side of your screen. Okay? All right. And Athens then just across that small inlet of water over to where? Corinth, right? And then he's going to move over into Cenchrea. This particular text illustrates to us. And he's eventually basically going to make his way where? Back where? Where's he trying to eventually get to here? He's trying to get back to Jerusalem, all the way across the Mediterranean Sea and eventually down into Jerusalem. And the interesting conversation about that is the fact that he's done what, according to verse 18? Okay, he's made a vow. What kind of vow? Well, it could be. It could be the Nazarite. And it could be a Jewish vow of some kind of sort, most likely connected to something related to the Jewish vow, simply because where else would he have gotten it from? But all in all, we really don't what? We don't know. The answer to that in its genuineness is we don't know. We're not sure what this vow is. That Nazarite vow was the strictest in some ways of vows that they made in Old Testament times, which limited things like their ability to cut their hair. It limited the places they could go, couldn't go into where dead bodies were. There were purification issues that happened. There was a ceremonial purification that occurred when the vow was over. There were lots of things connected to that Nazarite vow, but we don't technically know. There's obviously some carryover from their traditional Jewish ways, even though they had given up the Old Testament law as a law. It doesn't mean that they had abandoned everything that was traditional or customary in relationship to the way they conducted themselves and lived. I think that's evident, not to throw another book into our study here, but we can do that. I think that's evident in some of the things Paul says in Romans chapter 14, when he has that lengthy discussion about feast days and holidays and conscience and all that discussion, that it's obvious to me that the Apostle Paul recognized that some folks wouldn't quit getting together with their families on Passover just because they had become Christians. Some families would continue to get together on Pentecost even though they had become Christians. They were not honoring those days as Jewish law, but they weren't going to give up every customary tradition that those families may have done for centuries. And so Paul's simply doing what he's probably done before. He feels a need to make a vow, a commitment, a devotion unto God, and so in his own personal way, he's elected to do that, and he shaves his head in Cenchrea, and he makes a vow. And where does he end up then in verse 19? Ephesus. Yeah. Well, and it could easily, that's what I'm saying. Because we don't know what this vow is, it's hard to qualify what's happening and why it's happening and when it's happening. Because we don't know. And you're right, in the Nazirite vow was if you were at the beginning of it, you're not going to let a razor touch your head until the end of the vow. And so if that was the one, then if we could definitively say this was the Nazirite vow, then you're right. This would have to be meaning he shaved his head because he had made a vow and now it's over. And so if that be the case, that's a potential here as well. We just don't have enough information to help us know exactly why Paul's doing what he's doing. But he's made some kind of devotion that's requiring certain things from him. So then he heads where? He heads over to Ephesus. So you're crossing the bottom part of the Aegean Sea, and so you're traveling from up in this region. You're traveling across past these small islands and over into Ephesus, where we'll find Paul for just a few moments here in the text. And so from Ephesus, and left them there. Who there? Priscilla and Aquila. Okay, Priscilla and Aquila had been with him from Corinth up until he arrives at Ephesus. He leaves them there, but he himself entered into the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. His common practice is being fulfilled, going into the synagogue and having discussions with the Jews concerning Jesus. Did they show some interest, according to verse 20? That's right. There was enough interest that they said, why don't you stay a little longer? There's more we'd like to know about this. This is interesting enough to us that maybe you could stay just a little while longer and continue to discuss these things with us. But what was his response to that? No, King James says, he bade them farewell, saying, I must by all means keep this feast that cometh in Jerusalem, but I will return again unto you, if God will. And he sailed from Ephesus. And so, Paul's trying to get to where again? And why is he trying to get there? And he's trying to get there for the feast. Now, that could have a various set of reasonings for that. Can you think of reasons why Paul might be trying to get to Jerusalem before the feast occurs? Yeah. Lots of people, going to be lots and lots of Jews around. Right? So your audience grows exponentially. Is that a word? I don't know what it means, but I used it. It multiplied. That's a word I do know. It multiplied when you go into a feast time there in Jerusalem. And so that might be one of the reasons why he's trying to get there. Maybe he's what? Maybe he's just, as accustomed, maybe going down simply because he wants to be there for the feast. Again, they've made drastic changes when they've made this commitment to abandon, for lack of a better word, the Old Testament law as a law. And they've made great strides and commitments to let that be nailed to the cross and to embrace the new covenant found in Jesus Christ. It doesn't mean that they've quit being who they are in terms of family and customs and traditions that they'd had for a period of time. I think that's evident in several passages of Scripture that they maintain some things that were connected more to tradition and custom than they were to law. Yeah, we might see some evidence as we move forward, but it's obvious he's committed to getting there, because because you think about that for a minute. Here's really where I was trying to get at in terms of the importance of this thought. He just had a welcome audience. He just had a group of people tell him, we want to know more, we want to know more. But whatever he's trying to get to in Jerusalem, he has determined is more important than lingering with an open audience. That to me tells me whatever it is, it's important to him. And so, there's conclusions. He's trying to, finish certain aspects. Lots of little things that he may be tired, and getting down to the feast in Jerusalem might give him an ability to, the speculation's infinite, but the important thought is that he's determined that's where he needs to be, and he's willing to leave even a receptive audience to do that. And at other times when Paul wanted to get somewhere and God didn't want him to go, what did God do? He said, you're not going. That's right. He didn't let him go, right? He said, you're not going there. Doesn't seem to be the case. Go ahead, Kevin.
More than likely,
yeah.
It's the Passover, and he's trying to get down there for the Passover.
Yeah.
According to the time frame
of the events. Yeah. The time period of the events that have been going on in the time period of his travel and so forth, it's the most likely is that it's the Passover. And again, the emphasis is the most likely, again, not by way of definitive. Right. It seemed to be the great, and again, we could speculate all day long, and we just don't have that much information here. That's right. We don't know.
But Paul also told them he had a receptive audience.
Yeah.
He told them, "I'll come back."
Yeah, that's right.
I will come back.
Yeah, he didn't abandon them. Just he's determined that one thing is more crucial at the moment than another, and his promise to return, if the Lord wills. He will do so. Yeah. Yeah. Back to the heart of Judaism. Yeah.
I think it's important, Brian, just briefly to point out, Paul never taught that it was wrong for the Jews to partake in those feasts as a Jew.
Right.
He never taught that. He did teach that it was wrong to bind those things on Gentiles.
Yeah.
As necessary to salvation.
Right. So he ends up in Ephesus. He sailed from Ephesus, and when he landed at Caesarea and going up and saluted the church, he went down to Antioch. And after he had spent some time there, he departed and went over all the country of Galatia and Phrygia in order, doing what? Strengthening all the disciples. And so he's revisiting locations and places that he has been, trying to continue to strengthen the disciples that have already become believers. And in verse 24 then, who does he encounter? A certain Jew named Apollos, born at Alexandria. Where's that? Right? Named Alexandria because of Alexander Great. Good, you remembered that 400 years of silence study we did, right? He was of which of the? He's Greek, right? He's a Greek. Was really in many senses the greatest Greek emperor, and so this city becomes known for him. And this Apollos is what kind of orator? Right? An eloquent man, right? Mighty in the Scriptures. And he came to Ephesus. And this man was instructed in the way of the Lord, and being fervent in the Spirit, he spoke and taught diligently the things of the Lord. But what one aspect of him is interesting? He only knew the baptism of John. Let me take a step back. What that means that Apollos is a preacher, if you will, a minister, one who is a teacher of God's Word, but he is not what? He's not a full-fledged disciple of Jesus, because he can't be if all he knows is the baptism of John. What else isn't he if he only knows the baptism of John? Okay, he can't be an apostle. In my mind, he cannot be inspired. An inspired man would know everything about an inspired man would not be still preaching and teaching the baptism of John. He needs to get there. And so here's a man who was willing to preach and teach the message, who had no inspired ability to do such. My point from that is we're now seeing in the early stages of folks who are declaring the message simply by the knowledge and information they had gained. And he's a little further along than just the Old Testament system, because he's up to where? He's up to John. Okay, he's one step away from Jesus. So this isn't a man who's just talking about Old Testament law, but he's also talking about the predecessor to the great king that would come. But he's only teaching them what he knows. So he can't be inspired. He's not being driven by the Holy Spirit. And so he's simply teaching the things that he had understood. And he's preaching boldly in the synagogue. Yeah. To me, I think you're right, Gary. I think that's evident that it's obvious he has not encountered the apostles after the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, because that information would have been first and foremost in the message of those apostles. Now, why does he encounter Aquila and Priscilla rather than Paul? All right, Paul left them in Ephesus. And I just say that because what we just saw in the narrative there was Paul went here, he went here, he went here, he went here. But he left Priscilla and Aquila back in Ephesus. So rewind in terms of where we're at. We're back in Ephesus for a moment, dealing with Priscilla and Aquila and Apollos and the things that are occurring there as Paul's making his continued journey. These are the events, or this is an event that's happening back in Ephesus when he left Priscilla and Aquila there. So Apollos is speaking boldly in the synagogue. When Aquila and Priscilla heard it, they took him unto them and expounded unto him the way of God more what? More perfectly or factually or accurately, completely. Apollos isn't a bad guy. In fact, he's just one step away from knowing the fullness of the truth. Apollos apparently and obviously is a good man, one who's going to be an asset because people will listen to him. He has an ability to convey the information. And so he's everything you need in someone who's going to spread the gospel. He just needs the gospel. He needs the fullness of the information necessary. And what I appreciate about is that it seems as though Priscilla and Aquila get a sense about him that what manner did they choose to teach him? Right. They got a sense of it. Sometimes you might see an occasion where somebody's preaching something false, and in the very moment, one of the apostles might do what? Speak up and challenge that. But this wasn't a moment for public rebuke. I think Priscilla and Aquila got a sense of Apollos in some ways that allowed for them to see him as one who was teachable and approachable, as someone that they could sit down and talk with about these things rather than just jumping in with both feet and publicly challenging Apollos in this occasion. There'd be another time to go back to the synagogue and go over the fullness of the truth of this message. But they take him aside and expounded unto him the way of God more perfectly. We sometimes also use this text to illustrate that in private settings, who was involved in this teaching? Okay, the context implies in the synagogue, whom when Aquila and Priscilla had heard, they took him unto them, and they did two things. They took him unto them and expounded unto him the way of God more perfectly. In a private setting, here's a man and a woman and another man in a conversation about the will of God. And that goes no less and no further than that, by the way. It doesn't prove anything other than if a husband and a wife have a person they know and they take them aside and invite them into their home or whatever it might be, and they want to sit down and open the Bible with them, here's an example of something exactly like that happening in Scripture. We don't see her in the pulpit. We don't see her in any public forum. All the further the example goes is this private moment that they have. But it also shows that she's just as much aware of the truth of the gospel as he is. That Aquila is not the only one who has knowledge and ability to convey the message of Jesus. She had just as much knowledge, potentially, and ability to convey that information over to Apollos as Aquila did, and you see them working hand in hand together to accomplish that. And what I appreciated about it as well is that you get a sense that Paul understood. To my knowledge, help me if I'm wrong, there were some women who traveled with Jesus, but you see them more in comfort and supportive kind of roles. But when these journeys began, Paul goes and he takes Barnabas, or he takes John Mark. That didn't last long, but he takes John Mark, or he takes Timothy, or he takes Silas. But when he leaves from Corinth to go down to Ephesus, he doesn't tell Aquila, you come and go to Ephesus and leave Priscilla here to keep making tents, right? He has them both come. There might be some wisdom of Paul in recognizing the benefit that they together would bring to the table. All that to get to this thought, to make sure we grab this. We can become consumed with public worship and participants to an extent that we fail to realize the great strength and benefit that women can bring to the spread and teaching of the gospel and letting the world know. Just because she may not be in the pulpit or standing behind a rostrum does not mean she doesn't have exactly the things necessary to share the gospel around the kitchen table. And husbands and wives working together to share the message of Jesus is a tremendous asset to any church or place that they find themselves. And I see the wisdom of Paul in letting this couple travel together, finding a place for them that seems fitting, leaves them there and says, go to work. And that's exactly what they do. Yeah. And there have been folks we've known over the years, women who were extremely knowledgeable and willing in the right ways to share that knowledge with others. Yeah. You'll see this disposition change in him. Any other thoughts? So when he was disposed then to pass into Achaia, the brethren wrote, exhorting the disciples to receive him, who when he was come helped them much which had believed through grace. And so we don't have all the details, but what we know is that the end result of this conversation was that Apollos has now moved from becoming a believer in the doctrine of John or the teachings of John the Baptist to fully understanding the fullness of Scripture, and he is set forth and commended and exhorted that the other disciples would receive him, and he became a great encouragement because of that. For he mightily convinced the Jews, and that publicly, showing by the Scriptures that Jesus was the Christ. Up until now, he's been telling people about just this fellow by the name of John the Baptist, who was this voice out in the wilderness, and all these things that John the Baptist had accomplished. Now he's out there preaching and teaching the fullness of Jesus the Christ and the benefit of that. Any thoughts about this scene here in Ephesus, or anything left over out of chapter 18? Yeah.
Here was a man who was teaching baptism, wasn't teaching the right baptism. Yeah. So consequently, he had to change in order to be right.
Right.
Well, there's various baptisms today. And people can say, well, I was baptized. May not have been baptized the right way.
Right.
So that's a question that one has to answer for himself, I guess, rather than some other way. But yeah, when he saw the need to change his baptism or then to change his teaching, that's why
he was receptive to that. And at some point, you know, that Ephesians 4 challenges us. We kind of, you know, we understand the idea of, you know, one faith, one Lord, you know, but you get to one baptism, and you get to that phrase, one baptism. The challenge of that thought is that throughout history there have been multiple baptisms. In specific, there was the baptism of John the Baptist. History bears out that even before John the Baptist, there had been ritualistic and ceremonial baptisms that were going on among Jews even prior to John the Baptist. There's archaeological finds that show these baptistries that they had built for these ceremonial and ritualistic baptism, purification baptisms that people were using and going through. So up until Jesus, they had understood the concept of a baptism. But there was time now to come to the one baptism that was necessary. And here's a man who didn't just embrace the fact that he had had a baptism. He embraces the fact that Jesus the Christ is a much fuller and complete message that he needed to embrace.
Kind of significant statements about him. Verse 25, it says, he had been instructed in the way of the Lord. I'm not exactly sure if that means Old Testament instructions, or maybe he knew some about the new king and stuff that's coming, which is
sure.
From the Old Testament. And after that, it says he spoke and taught accurately the things of the Lord. Yeah. So he only knew the one baptism. So I don't know, he could have learned or understood some things about Jesus from the Old Testament. He could have learned them from another Christian someplace too.
Yeah.
But he just didn't learn the right baptism.
Yeah. And he'd obviously gotten at least to the knowledge that John the Baptist had been sharing. And John the Baptist's whole message was, there's one coming, there's one bigger than me coming. And if he understood that, he just needed to know that person's already happened. And keeping in mind, a certain Jew named Apollos, born at Alexandria, which is way away, okay? You know, his knowledge is kind of slowly gets to the places he would be. This isn't a fellow that grew up in Jerusalem and was around all of these events. He just needed to know a little more. Yeah, showing by the script. He's Jew, and he knows the Old Testament apparently very well, and so he's just like, he's not inspired like the apostles, but he is like them in the sense that he can go to a Jew now and show exactly how that old law drives them straight to the arrival of Jesus. Yeah. He was a believer in that. It appears that some had abandoned almost the concept of a Messiah ever arriving, but he had, and yeah. And that's the challenge. And that's really kind of part of this whole conversation in a lot of ways. Even the eunuch in Acts chapter 8, the piece of the puzzle kind of lacking in his mind was, who is the Messiah? Who is the one that was led like a lamb to the slaughter and slain? That's kind of the missing piece of the puzzle for so many, is just this final moment of the one you've been waiting for, the one salvation's found in. That's Jesus the Christ. He's the one. Okay, grab your questions if you have them. We'll go through them just to summarize the chapter real quick out of Acts chapter 18. And then we can maybe introduce chapter 19 anyway for a moment here this morning. So who's introduced in the beginning of this chapter? Okay, Aquila and Priscilla. And what personal fact do we learn about Paul? Okay, we've learned that he was a tent maker, that he joined himself to these two individuals because they had a common bond of being tent makers. What was Paul's reaction to the disbelief and blasphemy of the Jews? Right. He shook the dust off his raiment and he said, your blood's on your own heads. And he moves on. I'm going to take the message to the Gentiles. Did the conversion of Crispus have any effect on others? Yeah, tremendous effect. When you get a chief ruler of the synagogue to make these kinds of changes, then it motivates others to think about it as well. What instructions did God give to Paul in a vision? Don't be afraid to speak. Speak bold. And how long did he stay there? A year and 6 months, or a year and a half. Remember, he said, don't be, I've got a lot of people here. There's a lot of good that can happen here, so don't be afraid. Go ahead and continue to work here. What was Gallio's reaction to the Jews bringing Paul to him for judgment? Yeah, really. Right. He drives them out, but the reason for that is based on what Gary just said, that he looks at him and says, listen, you guys deal with that. You're bringing charges against him that are of Jewish law. And the Romans don't care about it. Just go on and deal with it if you want to deal with it, but it doesn't have anything to do with us. What happened to Sosthenes? He was beaten, and again, we had long discussions last week. We won't revamp all that, but why was because he failed to what? He failed to convince Gallio to deal with this. And so whether it was embarrassment over that and the Greeks did it, or whether it was frustration of the Jews, the point is that he failed to get Paul condemned by the Romans. What was Apollos teaching? Okay, all he knew was John. And did he do that in a sincere way? Yeah, he's sincere about it, just needed more knowledge. Who instructed him concerning the completed gospel message? Aquila and Priscilla, both of them take him, expound unto him, fulfill those purposes. What was Apollos' reaction to the instruction? Gladly received, began to go and preach and teach more fully the completed message of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And the final question I asked you was, what are some practical things we can learn from the account of Apollos? Okay, willingness to change. That's a great lesson from Apollos. You can be fully convinced of something and it may still not be right. You've got this example of a woman involved in a private study of the gospel of Jesus Christ.
I think an important thing for especially a new convert is to, like we see Apollos, he was teaching what he knew as accurately as he could. If we're a new convert that wants to go teach someone, teach what you know.
Yeah.
Teach what you know as accurately as you can. If you need help, someone will come and help you.
Yeah. And one of the key things that we skimmed around in relationship to Apollos, but didn't really directly say, is that he didn't teach anything that was wrong. He just taught incompletely. He said the truth about John the Baptist. He said the truth about the Old Testament. He just didn't tell everything that needed to be told. And so he, even though he was convinced in his mind that's all that he needed to tell them, didn't make it all he needed to tell them. So that's the sincerity part. And so Kevin's right. Don't fear just because I feel like I don't know the Bible as well as somebody else, that I can't go and share with somebody the hope and the reason for the hope that is within me and what I know about the gospel and the passages that I could share with folks. Anything else? Any other practical things that you thought of out of that example of Apollos? I'll come back. Right. He didn't miss a step. Yeah. Right. And I love his disposition about that. That he didn't get defensive, he didn't get aggravated, he didn't get upset. He let Priscilla and Aquila share with him, and he was receptive when he was because it's obvious he was able to then go back into the very scriptures he's known for a long time and see that they were telling him the what? Telling him the truth. He was able to see that Jesus fits the description of what he saw as the Messiah under the Old Testament law, and was able to draw those conclusions. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that is an important lesson here, that they were very astute and wise in the manner in which they chose to deal with this, and you could easily have turned this into a much different scene if handled differently. And we've all witnessed that. We've seen times where when all that really needed was some simple private education, but somebody took somebody to task publicly, and it became a bigger problem than it needed to be. Yeah, and now what's he doing right now? He's out after that. He's out encouraging disciples. But if they attack him in the synagogue and it gets known that Priscilla and Aquila said Apollos is a bad guy and teaching things that are wrong, then his ability to get beyond that is going to be difficult. And so there is wisdom all around in the way this was handled.